Hello, I'm Rick Chisa, PSE's Government Relations Director, here with a brief report on political action. It goes without saying that 2020 has been a year like no other in recent memory. Here are some of the government and legislative priorities PSE has been focusing on this year. Lawmakers met for a 60-day session starting January 13 and ending March 12. I'm going to focus on 5 of our biggest highlights in Olympia this year. First, House Bill 1888. PSE members and thousands of other state and local public employees needed a permanent solution for a persistent harassment by the Freedom Foundation. Huge numbers of workers contacted lawmakers last fall and winter, and that helped build broad support for a bipartisan agreement. An agreement was made with the news media to allow limited disclosure, but in the end, the legislation permanently exempts date of birth from public employee disclosure, and that passed by wide margins. It was a nice win. Now, Senate Bill 6189 started out as an attempt to take away healthcare eligibility for substitute employees and coaches. PSE succeeded in striking these harmful provisions, and in their place, we amended SB 6189, ensuring continued SEBB health insurance coverage for school employees throughout the pandemic, as long as employees remain employed. Provisions of this legislation extend into the 2020-21 school year, as long as Governor Inslee's emergency declaration is in effect. A quick note for our higher education members: there were no changes to the cost or structure of the PEBB system for state employees. House Bill 2458. Now, once the state started the new SEB health insurance program in January, we needed a fix in the state law to clarify what local optional insurance and related benefits could continue to be offered by school districts. 3 months of negotiations with the State Healthcare Authority resulted in a bill that protects limited benefits for school districts to offer. Most importantly, this legislation preserves cancer care and VIBA as 2 popular employee benefit programs. House Bill 1521 dealt with contracting out state-level classified work to the private sector. This has been the #1 priority for our higher education membership for several years, and this year we finally got the bill to become law. There were many concerns among members at our higher education institutions that classified work is often being subcontracted to the private sector with little or no oversight or accountability. Higher ed doesn't have the same protections about contracting out as K-12, but this new legislation restricts state agencies and higher ed institutions from contracting out for services customarily and historically provided by classified employees, unless they have a new comprehensive impact assessment. Finally, paraeducator development. Securing additional funding for paraeducator development so that all 28 hours of professional development time was paid for by the state each year. This was PSE's biggest budget priority this year. We succeeded in securing an additional $14 million. However, this was a short-lived victory, as Governor Inslee determined that many well-meaning program enhancements needed to be trimmed as part of $200 million in overall reductions to the state budget, as the COVID virus was beginning to hit our state very hard. You can learn about these highlights as well as other K-12 and labor bills by logging on to the member portal and clicking on legislative updates. Whatever your technology, you can also find all sorts of additional information on the measures I just talked about. Go to leg.wa.gov, click on bill information. This site includes text of the actual bills and laws, descriptions of what the bill would do, summaries of public testimony, links to TVW programming, and roll call reports. You can also click on the House or Senate and look up more information on the lawmakers who represent you in Olympia. Since the legislative session ended, virtually all of PSE's attention has been focused on dealing with the COVID crisis. This slide shows some of the major state actions related to COVID-19. Shared leave, House Bill 2739, in addition to allowing K-12 and higher ed employees to maintain up to 40 hours of leave in reserve and still be eligible for shared leave. This bill also allows for greater leave sharing for employees who have to be isolated or quarantined due to COVID-19. The new law also allows for intermittent and non-consecutive use of shared leave. Governor Inslee's proclamations. Governor has issued 60 separate proclamations as of July 23rd, with 176 extensions. In contrast, Governor Inslee issued a total of 64 proclamations over the previous 7 years of his administration. So you can see he's been very busy in this regard. The Attorney General letter, I will say something about this in just a moment. Coronavirus bill. This is where the state took $175 million out of the state's rainy day fund to pay for expanded unemployment benefits and other public health supports, including purchasing personal protective equipment. And Employment Security Department emergency unemployment rules. So let's look at that letter from Attorney General Bob Ferguson. He issued this letter from his office clarifying that the use of paid leave was not a gift of public funds. He wrote this letter in response to a request by Superintendent Chris Rakedahl. And perhaps no other state action was more impactful in terms of preserving wages for PSE members during the school closure than this guidance by the Attorney General. You can find a copy of this letter on the member portal under legislative updates. Now let's look at the federal level. The Congress took 3 major actions in March to respond to the COVID crisis: provide additional unemployment insurance benefits and send money to the states, schools, and local governments to make up for lost tax revenue. First, the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Appropriations Act, cost of $8.3 billion, passed on March 4th. The Family First Coronavirus Relief Act, $100 billion bill, passed on March 18th. And then the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, otherwise called the CARES Act, worth $2 trillion, passed on March 27th. Now, except for an expansion of the Paycheck Protection Program, which was mostly loans to small businesses, the Congress has not approved any additional aid programs since March 27th. It's been 136 days now, but that could change very shortly. Currently in Washington, D.C., the Congress, the House and Senate, and the White House are in negotiations over an additional stimulus bill. Now, the House passed a HEROES Act worth $3 trillion in aid on May 15th. More recently, Senate Republicans presented their plans for economic stimulus on July 27th. Now the House of Representatives, the Senate, and White House continue to debate what would be included in a 4th coronavirus measure, including more support to states and local municipalities to make up for reduced revenue, additional unemployment insurance provisions, and other economic and health protections for workers. Now, negotiations are happening now, so if you can pick up your phone and call your member of Congress or send them an email and tell them to support our schools and education workers, will help a great deal. Now, members are involved in every aspect of PSE's political action programs and activities. As you can see, we had a tremendous turnout in January for our legislative conference. It seems like only an eternity ago. A few weeks later, a smaller but similarly enthusiastic group of PSE members attended our lobby day in February. These members helped add momentum on our legislative priorities. In late February, leaders from our higher education institutions traveled to Olympia. They heard great perspectives from Western Washington University Professor Bill Line, and they met with several key lawmakers and staff. Now, PSE has a tremendous legislative internship program. The members you see here get released from their jobs to spend an entire week in Olympia learning about the legislative process and stepping up their advocacy efforts. This year's class was impressive. From the left to the right, you see Michelle Barmore from Ferndale, Robert Bernard from Tahoma, Donna Burgess from Manson, Carol Crowell from Richland, and Nyla Duvall from Granger. Again, I invite you to visit the legislative updates on the member portal to read these members' stories of their week in Olympia. Most recently, our legislative council members have been meeting in person or via Zoom with candidates all across the state. We'll talk about elections in just a minute. Finally, 3 PSE members were appointed by Superintendent Chris Rakedahl to OSPI's Reopening of Schools work group. Many thanks to Jody Japp, Jennifer Salatis, and Ryan Peterson for their many hours of work. PSE also participated in an advisory work group with the Department of Health and is now working with a coalition of pupil transportation unions to ensure state dollars continue to flow to school districts during the next school year. Shifting gears to elections. Just last week was the primary election for state legislative races, statewide executive offices like governor and state superintendent, or OSPI. We've got roughly 12 weeks to the general election on November 4th. PSE is working hard to make sure the voices of educators and working people are heard during this election cycle. Already, your legislative council members have spent dozens of hours on Zoom calls, interviewing candidates, talking PSE issues, and learning more about the vision of the people who are running to represent us in Olympia. Prior to the primary election, PSE endorsed 72 candidates and provided each of them with a financial contribution. You can see which candidates PSE endorsed by logging onto the portal and clicking on legislative updates. Now, as we speak, legislative council members are reaching out to those top 2 candidates who will be moving on to the general election. The council will make additional endorsement and contribution recommendations later this month. Then the board of directors will take action soon after that. In short, elections matter. Making education policy does not start in Olympia. It starts when you elect education champions who will stand up for Washington's schools and universities. So much is at stake right now. The vast majority of K-12 and higher education funding dollars comes from Olympia. And the people who sit in those seats have an impact on how much funding is available, not to mention all the policy decisions that impact your district and university. Remember, you have the power to decide who will represent us in Olympia, so make sure that you vote on November 3rd. That's all for now. Again, please visit the member portal on the website, where you can read updates and see what is happening at the state and federal level that could affect you and your job. I'm Rick Chisa. We'll see you again soon.